Hello and welcome to my video lecture on writing introductions and conclusions. So this video will address the challenges of beginning and concluding any document. That's something we all as writers struggle with at some point, whether this would be a college essay or a business letter. It's always difficult to get started. And then when we get to the end of our document, finding an interesting way to wrap it up. So I will discuss basic concepts of content and structure using a template that I provide to my students in my freshman writing courses. And then I'm going to look at a couple of sample papers with you, sort of point out things that work and things that don't work so well. So in the first document I'm going to look at, I want to begin with the introductory paragraph. So the introductory paragraph should always begin with a topic sentence. And the topic sentence should provide kind of an idea of what the paper is or the document is basically about. Okay, so that could be fairly general, but it should give the reader an idea of where this is going. One thing that I would caution you not to do, I occasionally see this in student papers, and that is beginning with a quote. Like a famous person once said, unless you can find the perfect quote that just beautifully sums up everything you're trying to say, and then obviously it could work, for the most part, try to stay away from that approach. The important thing in the introductory paragraph is to establish context for your document, for your argument, for your purpose, your thesis, whatever the case may be, as well as exigency. And exigency or exigence means that we have to establish why the reader should care about this. So it's the so what factor. Why should I be interested in reading that? And that's where we have to be careful, because sometimes I think students in academia kind of get that impression that it doesn't matter what we write, people are just going to be fascinated to read it, and that's not really the case in real life. All of us are very busy. If we don't realize what benefit we can gain from reading something, we're not going to read it because we just simply don't have the time. And if it's not clear why it should be of interest to me, then why would we waste that time? So the important thing in creating introductory paragraph is that we have to introduce facts, so not opinions. So this is not a sort of meandering kind of everyone knows and here's what I think. Provide statistics, quotes from experts that you might need, historical facts, whatever the purpose is. Provide facts that are relevant to your argument or your purpose. So context is, for the reader, necessary knowledge. So that's the other thing you have to consider, is what does my reader already know? What is considered basic information? What are facts that I might need to cite my source for because it's not considered general knowledge? And again, the exigency, which is proof of importance, and urgency. At the end of your introductory section, you should have your thesis or purpose statement. And that's when we refer to documents in the direct approach. There's also a document structure in indirect approach. I'm not going to address it in this video. In that situation, we are not going to state our purpose or our thesis at the end of the introductory paragraph. The introductory paragraph would also be structured much differently and would contain different content, but in direct approach, and that's how we in Western culture prefer to communicate, we're going to state our purpose or thesis statement, our central idea, our reason for writing this at the end of the introductory paragraph, so your reader knows where this is going. Again, as if we put ourselves in the situation of the reader, if we have read an introductory section of a document and at the end of that section we have no idea where this is going, chances are we're not going to continue reading. So as the writer, please let your reader know where this is going. That's our introduction. So we're going to look at that in more detail, obviously. I want to briefly talk about body paragraphs. This is not really what I'm dedicating this video to, but I want to address it anyway. So the body paragraphs have to contain the evidence as well as the analysis of those facts that support our purpose or our thesis statement. So sometimes you may have to define some terms that your reader needs to understand before you can go into more detail in terms of presenting data, facts, and the analysis of those data. For example, we're going to look at a sample paper in which the writer talks about potential strategies for treating PTSD. So before we can really get started on looking at the facts, we need a medical or psychological definition of PTSD. One thing there I want to just point out, please don't look at dictionary definitions. If you're going to talk about a medical issue, the definition should come from a medical expert source. If it's psychological, it should be a psychological expert source. The other thing to consider in the body paragraphs is you're going to need as many body paragraphs as will be necessary to discuss all the different points you're going to use as support for your thesis, being discussed in paragraphs where you have only the discussion of one idea. So that's what we call a unified paragraph. So sometimes students write these long paragraphs that have 2 or 3 or 4 or more ideas that we're all sort of cramming together. It may be clear to you as the writer what you're trying to say. As someone who is reading it for the first time and it gets bombarded with all these different ideas in that same long paragraph, that person is going to be lost at some point. So poor organization, poor structure is not going to help your reader understand what you're trying to say. So always consider what the reader needs from us as the writers in order to comprehend what we're saying in a first reading. So the body paragraph should have a topic sentence. That should be the sentence that introduces what that specific paragraph is going to be about. Then we're going to present the facts. We're going to analyze, show how they support our purpose or thesis. And then ideally we should have a transition sentence that takes us from the specific focus of that paragraph to that of the following paragraph. And that brings us to the concluding paragraph. So one thing I frequently see from my freshman writing students is they were taught at some point in their high school career that the concluding paragraph is where we now restate our thesis, which to them sometimes means that we're now going to state exactly what we've already stated as a thesis statement. Sometimes students literally copy and paste their thesis statement from the introductory paragraph and the concluding paragraph, which is neither effective nor very original. And then the other thing they frequently do is they start summarizing all of the points they've just made in the body paragraphs, frequently in somewhat general terms. So it's really not helpful to now spend all this time rehashing things that you have said already in specific terms, in general terms. That's really not going to help anybody. So here's what I frequently recommend to my students. So if you really just want to restate your argument, do it in a very, very short paragraph. Don't drag that unnecessarily out because the reader wants to be done with it. The concluding paragraph is here to wrap it up, not to introduce new ideas or to take it into a totally different direction again or to establish a new argument. It has to wrap up the existing argument. So what I tell my students is if their paper is about a problem, so if the paper discusses a specific problem that we've now established in the body paragraphs through data and analysis, then the concluding paragraph could be a brief discussion of a potential solution. So that will automatically support your central idea and reiterate it, because by saying that here is a specific potential solution, we are reaffirming the fact that there's a problem, because if there weren't a problem, we wouldn't have a solution. But it's also a more interesting way to wrap it up. So we've established the problem. Where do we go from here? Okay, what would be a potential way of solving that? If your paper addresses a solution, then the concluding paragraph can sometimes be a brief discussion of a case of a specific person, sort of an anecdotal story about someone who benefited from that solution. In the body paragraphs themselves, we don't want to use anecdotal evidence. We could use it potentially as an example of something that we're discussing, but anecdotal evidence should never ever be our primary evidence, because all it establishes that something happened to one person. That does not establish any truths, any trends about anything. But if we have addressed the solution through research that shows clinical studies or experiments or whatever with larger numbers of people where the evidence clearly suggests that our argument is accurate. Then in the concluding paragraph, we can sort of personalize that argument and reiterate it by focusing on a specific example of one person. So there, I think it would certainly be acceptable. Let's start looking at the first paper. In this paper, the student is trying to establish an argument to support the passing of the James-Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act, essentially asking Congress to approve $4.3 billion in health care aid. If we're looking at the introductory paragraph, September 11, 2001, Muslim extremists attract portraits of American freedom and power, the Pentagon and the World Trade Centers. So, first of all, in terms of word choices, portraits really doesn't work that well. I think what the writer meant to say here is icons. So here's the problem. This paper is about providing health services and money to get health benefits for first responders. The paper is not about terrorism. This first topic sentence seems to imply. Next sentence. In an instant, first responders and civilian heroes were lost. So the problem that I'm going to point out to you with this introductory paragraph, we get the word hero, heroic, various versions of that multiple times in this introductory paragraph. What the writer is trying to do here is to establish an argument through value judgments. As far as the writer is concerned, these people were heroes, they risked their lives, and therefore we owe it to them to get these benefits. That's a problem. Value-based argumentations will rarely work in persuading people. The people who already share our values are going to wholeheartedly agree with everything we have to say, and the people who do not share our values are not going to be persuaded by that. Some people might argue that these policemen, these firefighters were doing their job. So we have to be careful here that we're not making this potentially faulty assumption that everyone is automatically going to agree with us. In the days, weeks, and months following the attacks, that becomes a little excessive. I would say pick one or the other. Since this was a very lengthy process, I would say in the months following the attacks, an outpouring of support by first responders to help to clear the rubble, search for survivors. Also potentially problematic here is months later we were not looking for survivors. And begin a chapter of rebuilding. However, unbeknown to these heroic volunteers, here we go again with the variation of the word hero, was the deleterious environment they immersed themselves in. Here is the problem. So we found this big word, probably in a thesaurus, that's a more fancy word for dangers. That doesn't really tell us what that means. It's just a big word. Soon after, these individuals would develop various respiratory issues, including more than 50 types of cancer, forever altering their lives. That's ultimately the only fact we get in this introductory paragraph, that these first responders would develop these respiratory problems, including 50 types or more of different cancers. We also need an in-text citation for that. So here is what we need to establish this argument. So the argument is ultimately, and that's the thesis statement in the final sentence of that paragraph, supporting the compensation fund to aid those who volunteered is paramount because these individuals are truly suffering from legitimate diseases incurred during the events of 9/11. Nothing that we have seen so far in the introductory paragraph is establishing any of that. We need facts, and the data we need to establish the context and the exigency would be, first of all, statistics on the problem, the number of dead, the number of wounded. It would also be helpful to get an estimate, at least, if we don't have an exact number, of the first responders involved in this process. So how many people are realistically affected by this? What kind of materials, what kind of toxins were they exposed to? So with building materials that would sort of be part of the problem as buildings are crumbling down, We may be looking at asbestos, at lead, at mercury, brominated copper, arsenic, which is in pre-treated wood, those kind of things. But what were they? So what was that deleterious environment? The other thing we also need to know is what are maybe 2 or 3 examples of respiratory diseases that usually result from the exposure to those toxins. So we can make the connection between this many people were involved in this process, they were exposed to these things. When we are exposed to these kind of toxins, this is usually what happens to our body, to our health. What kind of medical bills do they have? Why does their health insurance not provide the treatment they need for these issues? Okay. And again, we need in-text citations. This is research-based, and we need to see where this information is coming from. Okay. And once we have established all that, then we have established the foundation for the argument that Congress should pass an act to provide $4.3 billion in healthcare aid. Okay. And then in the body paragraphs, we need the detailed data that sort of expands on what we have hopefully established in the introductory paragraph. So if we can show the reader facts that show that this is an important issue, that this affects a lot of people, that this is not their fault, that this is something that is something they have no control over, and that they're unable to pay for their health and their medical treatment, then I think we won't have a problem establishing a sound argument. Now, let me look at the conclusion for this paper. Despite the negative outlook held by some Americans, and this is really not established anywhere in that paper, the new legislation is a step forward in the direction of recovery. A recovery that was long overdue for some of these individuals who gave of themselves during a dark time in American history. Even though we are forever in debt to them, this new act honoring James DeDroga and others like him allows us to express our gratitude for their service. Again, please let's not approach this as a value-based argument. This is, again, not effective in the sense that people who aren't sharing our values are not going to be persuaded by that. What I'd like to do now is look at the paragraph that the writer intended to be the final body paragraph, which I think would probably make a much more effective concluding paragraph. So we find out that the year before, the James DeDroga Act had actually been passed, providing these $4.3 billion in healthcare aid. If our argument in the paper is that this should be approved, although it seems kind of odd to make the argument that it should be approved if it has already been approved, although, again, the argument could be that although people might have been opposed to it, here's the reason why it made sense to approve it the year before. So I think that's still a valid argument. But that basically just looks at the solution. So by looking at the problems in the paper itself, we can now conclude the paper by saying the act has been approved, these people are now eligible for treatment, and their families may now rest easy knowing that healthcare payments is something they no longer necessarily have to worry about. And I think that's a much more effective and relevant way to end this than to talk about a dark time in American history and how we owe these people a debt. Let's talk about how we can make sure with that money that Congress has set aside, they can be helped. So what I'd like to do now is look at a second sample paper. So this is a student writing a paper about transcendental meditation being an alternative type of treatment for veterans returning from war zones with post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's look at the topic sentence here. Soldiers returning from war are often afflicted with post-traumatic stress disorder. So that, in sort of a general sense, is what this paper is about. So this sentence establishes the foundation on which we're now building additional information that's going to bring the argument to a more specific focus. So in the next sentence, we're finding out that according to the United States Department of Veteran Affairs, which is clearly a credible source, PTSD affects nearly 31% of Vietnam veterans, 11% of Afghanistan veterans, and 20% of Iraqi war veterans. Okay, this is coming from the NIH website, okay, nih.gov, paragraph 7. So here the writer is clearly establishing exigency by showing us through numbers how big of an issue this is. So 45, almost 50 years after the Vietnam War, almost a third of veterans are still suffering from PTSD. That's a pretty significant number. Okay? 11% of Afghanistan war veterans, 20% of Iraqi war veterans. Okay? Those are the kind of numbers we need to see that make it clear that this is an important issue that we need to pay attention to. So the writer then establishes that one technique that soldiers generally use to overcome PTSD, and that's sort of the traditional form of therapy, and that is prolonged exposure therapy. She then moves on to say that potentially transcendental meditation could replace traditional treatments because it is more effective. Now, we don't want to go into a whole lot of supporting information because, of course, we're going to do that in the body paragraph, but she very briefly touches on one experiment in which, after 3 months of using transcendental meditation, 7 out of 10 soldiers, 70%, felt so improved that they believed they no longer needed other treatments. So again, we need way more specific data to back this up, but that's just a quick introduction of data that show that this could work. So her very specific thesis statement is transcendental meditation is more effective than prolonged exposure therapy for overcoming PTSD in war veterans because it improves brain coherence, reduces stress more effectively, and increases mindfulness. So while it is not necessary to break down the argument into these 3 controls, it makes it more specific because we know what specific areas of research this writer is going to look at to establish that transcendental meditation may be a more effective treatment for PTSD than prolonged exposure therapy has been. In the body paragraphs of her paper, the student, first of all, defined what PTSD is. She defined prolonged exposure therapy. She defined transcendental meditation. And then she looked at very specific clinical studies, trials with larger numbers of service members going through both types of treatments, and how transcendental meditation was ultimately the more effective one. Let's briefly look at the conclusion paragraph. So this student here decided to simply restate her argument. So using transcendental meditation rather than prolonged exposure therapy may cause more veterans to overcome PTSD in a shorter amount of time. Because various experiments demonstrate that TM outperforms PE, TM may replace it as a traditional form of treatment and become more prevalent in the future. If we're going to just simply restate that, that's all we need. 2 sentences. Okay, and that's the other thing. I don't know at what point high school teachers sometimes instill the idea that paragraphs need to be a certain length and we kind of need to ramble on. Okay, if you're going to simply restate the general argument, the central idea, do it and get it over with. Now, since the student in this paper discusses a solution to PTSD and really goes into a lot of detail looking at the specific clinical trials and experiments and all that, here I think it would be interesting to sort of personalize that paper at the end by telling us, at least briefly, a specific story of a veteran, a young man or woman, coming back from Iraq, coming back from Afghanistan, who went through a transcendental meditation treatment and found it to be very effective and was healed in a reasonable short amount of time. So again, we're not going to use those kind of examples necessarily in the body of the paper, They could, again, as I said earlier, serve as a specific example of a larger thing that we're discussing. But I think it would be very interesting and a nice personal touch to use a story like that at the end. Thank you so much, and hopefully you will find this helpful in your writing.